Hey everyone, tonight we're going back. We have got a morning inside a 1950s kitchen where the rules were real and the coffee was always on, and someone had already been up for 2 hours before anyone else opened their eyes. We have got the story of Irma Rombauer, the woman who wrote The Joy of Cooking out of grief and stubbornness and a refusal to be quietly ruined, and whose book became something no publisher expected and no kitchen in America could quite do without. We have got a look at what it was like to be a home demonstration agent, one of those women hired by the county extension service to travel from farmhouse to farmhouse, teaching other women how to can vegetables and stretch a dollar and keep a household from falling apart at the seams, which turns out to be one of the more quietly heroic jobs anyone did in the mid-20th century. And then we're going to pull back the curtain on all of it, on the rules and the routines and the careful performance of cheerful competence, and look at what those 1950s kitchens actually cost the women inside them, not in dollars, but in time and energy and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being permanently on duty inside your own home. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here, and leave me a comment letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. The alarm does not ring so much as announce itself, a flat mechanical sound that arrives at 5:45 in the morning and does not apologise for anything. You silence it before it wakes your husband, which is its own small art, rolling toward the nightstand with the practiced economy of someone who has done this 600 mornings in a row and knows that the distance between the pillow and the clock is exactly the length of your arm when stretched to its absolute limit. The room is cold, not dramatically cold, not the biting cold of midwinter, but the particular coolness of an October morning in a house where the furnace has not yet decided to commit to the day. You sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, not thinking, not planning, just being vertical, which at this hour already counts as an accomplishment. Your feet find your slippers, which are where you left them, because you always leave them in exactly the same place. Because if you do not, the whole first 10 minutes of the morning become a small disaster. You pull your housecoat from the hook behind the door, the quilted one with the snap closures up the front, and you wrap it around yourself and you go down the hall toward the kitchen, moving quietly past the children's doors, past the bathroom with its dripping faucet you have mentioned twice this month, past the linen closet whose door does not close all the way, past all the small domestic details of a house that is yours and your husband's and your children's, and in some ways nobody's, because it belongs entirely to the maintenance of it, and you have been the person doing that maintenance since the day you moved in. The kitchen is the first room that is really yours in the morning, before the children come down asking for things, before your husband wants his eggs, before the radio goes on and the day picks up its particular weekday momentum. The kitchen belongs only to you, and you have learned to receive that small gift with something close to genuine gratitude. Even when you are tired, even when the previous evening ran long, and the dishes took until 9:30, and you did not sit down for the last time until nearly 10. You turn on the overhead light and it buzzes once before settling, and the kitchen appears around you. The linoleum floor in its pattern of pale green and cream squares, the yellow walls your mother said were too bright and you chose anyway, the white enamel stove with its 4 burners and its wide oven door, the formica counter in a pattern meant to suggest something cheerful, and the dish rack by the sink still holding 3 glasses from last night because you were too tired to put them away and told yourself you would do it in the morning, and now it is morning and here you are. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. You fill the percolator. This is the first real act of the day, and it is not casual. The amount of coffee matters, the water level matters, whether the lid seats properly on the basket matters, because if it does not, the coffee will taste wrong in a way that is difficult to explain but unmistakable once you know it, and you have known it since the 2nd week of your marriage, when your mother-in-law came for Sunday dinner and commented that the coffee tasted thin, which it had, and which you had not yet understood how to prevent. Now you know. Now you know about the grind, and the water, and the heat, and the way the percolator sounds when it is doing what it's supposed to do, versus the way it sounds when something is slightly off. You know these things the way you know a great many things in this kitchen, through repetition so complete that the knowledge has moved out of your mind and into your hands. The percolator goes on the back burner, the one with the slightly lower flame that keeps things warm without scorching, and you stand at the sink for a moment looking out the window at the backyard in the early dark. The lawn is still there, The neighbour's maple is beginning to lose its leaves in a way that will require raking by the weekend, and you already know that the raking will happen because you will mention it, and it will be agreed upon, and then on Saturday afternoon it will materialise as a task, and the question of who does it will resolve itself in the usual way. The maple does not care about any of this. The maple is doing exactly what it has always done. There is something faintly comforting about that. You take the bacon from the refrigerator, the Frigidaire with its chrome handle, and its particular smell of cold that is different from the smell of the food inside it, a clean metallic coolness that greets you every time you open the door, like a small clarification of what is real. The bacon goes into the cast iron skillet, which you prefer to the aluminum one for reasons you could not entirely articulate, but which have something to do with how the heat moves through it, how even it is, how the fat renders without burning in the corners. The cast iron skillet was your grandmother's, and it weighs as much as a small child, and you would not trade it for anything on the market today, regardless of what the advertisements say about modern cookware. The bacon begins to speak, that familiar morning language of fat in a hot pan, and the smell reaches you first and then fills the kitchen, and then begins to migrate toward the hallway, and you know from long experience that this is the real alarm in this house, that the smell of bacon cooking is what actually wakes your husband. Not the clock, not the light, not any particular intention on his part to be awake at any particular time, but the smell of bacon. And this means that you now have approximately 8 minutes before he appears in the doorway looking for coffee, which means that the percolator needs to have reached its particular readiness, which it has not yet, which is fine, because you planned for this, because you always plan for this, because planning is the invisible structure underneath every morning that looks effortless to everyone except the person who built it. You take the eggs from the carton, which is cardboard, and you set them on the counter, 4 of them because 4 people live in this house, and 4 people need breakfast, even if 2 of those people are at the moment still horizontal and entirely unaware of the effort being made on their behalf. The eggs are room temperature, or close to it, because you took them out last night before you went to bed, a habit your mother taught you and her mother taught her, the idea being that cold eggs straight from the refrigerator do not cook as evenly, that there is a difference between an egg that has had a moment to come to itself and an egg yanked directly from refrigerator to skillet, and that difference, small as it is, matters. Small differences always matter. That is perhaps the first rule of this kitchen, the one that precedes all the others, the one nobody writes down because it is assumed to be understood. Your husband appears in the doorway at 6:07, which is earlier than usual, which means he has something to say, or he slept poorly, or both. He is wearing his robe and his expression is the one that means he is present, but not yet fully operational, and you pour him coffee without being asked because that is not really a question that needs asking. He takes it, wraps both hands around the mug, and stands at the kitchen table rather than sitting, which means he will be in your way for approximately the next 4 minutes before he decides to go read the paper in the living room. You maneuver around him with the practiced ease of a person who has shared a kitchen with another person for 11 years and knows exactly how much space that person takes up, and in which directions he is likely to move. You do not bump into each other. You have not bumped into each other in years. This is not romance. It is choreography. The bacon comes out of the skillet and rests on a folded paper towel on a plate you have set at the back of the counter, and the grease stays in the pan because you will scramble the eggs in that grease, because that is how it is done, because the flavour is in the fat and wasting the fat is not something you do in this kitchen. You tilt the skillet slightly to distribute the grease evenly, and you crack the first egg, which you do against the rim of the skillet rather than against the counter, a distinction your mother-in-law considers incorrect and which you consider none of her business, and the egg falls clean and even. No shell, no broken yolk, and for a moment you feel the small specific satisfaction of a thing done exactly right in the way that only you know it is exactly right, which is a sensation that happens perhaps a dozen times a day in this kitchen and which nobody ever comments on. The children come down at 6:20. They come separately, which they have done since your daughter turned 9 and decided that arriving at the same time as her brother was somehow beneath her. Your son arrives first, still wearing pyjama pants, and he goes directly to the refrigerator and opens it, and stares into it with the particular blank optimism of a 10-year-old who believes that if he looks long enough, something interesting will materialize. You tell him to close the refrigerator and sit down. He closes the refrigerator and sits down. Your daughter arrives 2 minutes later, fully dressed, hairbrushed, carrying her homework in a stack, and she sits across from her brother and does not look at him, which is the current state of their relationship, which fluctuates between affection and Cold War depending on factors you have mostly stopped trying to track. Breakfast is on the table at 6:32. Eggs scrambled, bacon on a plate in the centre, toast made in the toaster with its cord that has started to fray slightly at the plug end, and which you have mentioned and which will be attended to. Eventually, probably, you assume. Orange juice from the can of frozen concentrate you prepared last night, because the rule about morning preparation is that some of it happens the night before, and some of it happens in the morning, and the art is knowing which task belongs in which column. You sit down with them, which you do every morning, because eating together matters, because the table is where the family exists as a unit rather than as separate people, occupying the same square footage, and you have a cup of coffee in front of you, and a piece of toast, and you will eat the toast in 5 minutes and drink the coffee for the next 20. And the conversation at this table will cover homework and the weekend, and whether it is cold enough for a coat today, and then it will be 6:55 and your husband will take his hat from the hook by the door, and the children will take their school bags and you will stand at the door and watch the three of them leave, and then the door will close and then the house will be yours again. This is the moment you have been building towards since 5:45. Not because the morning was unpleasant, not because you resent any of it exactly, but because the version of you that exists when you are alone in this kitchen is different from the version that exists in relation to everyone else, and the alone version gets so little time that when it arrives, even briefly, you notice it. You stand in the kitchen in the sudden quiet, and the percolator is still warm on the stove, and you pour yourself a second cup, and you stand at the window looking at the backyard again, and now there is enough light to see the maple clearly, and you look at it for a minute or two before you turn back toward the kitchen and the dishes and what comes next. What comes next is the kitchen itself, the clearing and the washing and the drying and the putting away, and then the sweeping of the floor, which will need it because your son dragged his chair and left a scuff mark on the linoleum near his usual spot that bothers you in a mild way you would not bother trying to explain to him. The dishes are rinsed and stacked in the rack to dry, because you do not have a dishwasher, because the kitchen was not built with one, and adding one has been discussed but not resolved, and in the meantime the dishes are done by hand twice a day at minimum, more if there has been any cooking beyond the routine. You wash from hottest to least hot, glasses first, then plates, then pots, because the glasses need the cleanest water and the pots can endure what remains, and you learned this from your mother, who learned it from her mother, and it has never been written down anywhere, but it is as fixed as anything in this kitchen. By 7:30 the kitchen is clean. Not just tidied, clean, wiped down and swept and restored to the condition that will allow the next set of tasks to begin cleanly. Because the rule, unwritten and absolute, is that you do not begin a new thing in a kitchen that is not clean from the last thing. This is not perfectionism, this is practical. A kitchen where the surfaces are clear is a kitchen where you can work, and working is what this room is for, and you are the person doing the working, and you do it well enough that its difficulty is essentially invisible to everyone who benefits from it. The morning stretches ahead of you now in its familiar shape. Monday is wash day in this house, has been since you moved in, because you discovered early that allowing laundry to accumulate past Monday created a kind of domestic debt that compounded faster than you could pay it back. So Monday is laundry, and the machine is in the basement. The Maytag wringer washer your husband carried down the stairs 2 winters ago, in a project that involves significant language and one skinned knuckle, and it works perfectly well and you are grateful for it, and it will run 4 loads today before the afternoon is out. But first, before the laundry, there is the matter of the grocery list, because Tuesday is shopping day, and the list must be complete by this evening, and completing the list requires knowing what you have and what you are planning to cook for the week, and planning what you are cooking for the week requires having thought it through, which you have, because you thought it through on Sunday after church, which is when you do your planning, because planning on Sunday means Monday morning is organised, and organised Monday mornings are the hinge on which the whole week turns. You take the small notepad from the drawer next to the refrigerator, the drawer that also holds rubber bands, a few bottle caps your son collected and forgot, a pencil stub, and a piece of string of no identifiable purpose. The notepad is where the list lives. You open it to a fresh page and you begin writing, not from memory, but from the systematic practice of opening each cabinet and each drawer and the refrigerator and the freezer and taking actual inventory, because the alternative is arriving at the A&P on Tuesday morning with a list made from assumptions, which leads to duplicates and gaps, and the particular frustration of arriving home missing the one thing the whole meal depended on. So you open the cabinet above the stove which holds your spices, Morton salt in the round blue container with the girl and the umbrella, a tin of black pepper, paprika, ground cloves, dried thyme, celery salt, and a small bottle of vanilla extract that is about a third full and will need replacing within 2 weeks. You check the vanilla against what you know you are planning to bake this week, which is a spice cake for Thursday and possibly a batch of oatmeal cookies for the weekend, and you write vanilla on your list. The cabinet inventory is not glamorous, but it is the foundation of everything else. You move systematically, left to right, top shelf to bottom, and you write what you need, and you note what is running low, and you make mental calculations about what is on sale at the A&P this week, because you saw the circular that came in the mail on Friday, and the pork chops are a good price this week, which means pork chops Thursday, and you can move the spice cake to Friday, which actually works out better anyway, because your mother-in-law is coming Saturday and the spice cake will be better on Saturday if it was baked Friday. This is the kind of thinking that happens continuously in the background of a day in this kitchen, the constant low-level logistics of feeding a family on a particular budget, across a particular week, inside a particular set of preferences and requirements and constraints, and none of it appears on any list anywhere because it lives entirely in your head, where it has always lived, where it will continue to live until further notice. There is a rule about the icebox, which is to say the refrigerator, that you follow without having been told. Leftovers go on the second shelf, always, in covered containers, always, and the oldest leftovers go toward the front always so that nothing hides in the back until it becomes a problem. This is a system, and systems are what keep a kitchen from becoming a source of waste and expense. And waste and expense are two things you take seriously in a way that goes deeper than habit, because you grew up in the Depression, and everyone who grew up in the Depression has a particular relationship to the inside of a refrigerator that does not go away simply because times have changed. You know what it is to open a refrigerator and find it nearly empty and feel the specific weight of that emptiness. You know that feeling even though your refrigerator is currently full, and knowing it means you never entirely forget it, which means your refrigerator is never allowed to become a place where food disappears unexamined. The rule about bread is that you always have it and you never let it go stale without purpose. Stale bread makes bread crumbs, which go into a tin on the back of the counter, and breadcrumbs go into meatloaf and into casseroles and onto the top of the macaroni and cheese before it goes in the oven, and so bread that might otherwise be waste becomes instead a component, which is the kind of conversion this kitchen performs constantly, the transformation of what is almost nothing into something that feeds 4 people without anyone noticing the effort behind it. You check the bread. Half a loaf, enough for lunches today and tomorrow, and you add a loaf of Wonder Bread to the list, though you consider, not for the first time, whether you might begin baking your own, because the bakery bread at the A&P is good, but the home-baked bread is better, and you know it, and you have the time on Fridays more or less, and you make a note to think about it more seriously after Thanksgiving, when the baking instinct tends to come back fully formed. The pantry shelf holds your canned goods in their particular arrangement: tomato soup, cream of mushroom soup, cream of chicken soup, whole tomatoes, green beans, corn, peas, beets, tuna packed in oil, sardines your husband likes and no one else does, evaporated milk, condensed milk, chicken broth, and a can of Spam that has been there for some time, and which you keep meaning to incorporate into something and have not yet managed to. The canned goods are faced. This is not a habit you developed consciously, but one you noticed yourself doing after approximately 3 months of having your own kitchen, and realised you had absorbed from your mother, who absorbed it from hers. Tins face front, labels readable, nothing tucked randomly behind something else, because the alternative is a pantry where you cannot quickly see what you have, and a pantry where you cannot see what you have is a pantry that produces duplicates and surprises of the wrong kind. You add cream of mushroom soup to the list because you are planning a green bean casserole and you have used the last of it. Lunch is a smaller production, but it requires its own attention. You will have lunch alone today, which is Mondays and Tuesdays generally, because Wednesdays and Thursdays you're at the PTA and the church auxiliary respectively, and Fridays sometimes you have lunch with your neighbour Fern, which happens when Fern remembers to invite you and you are not otherwise occupied. Lunch alone is a meal you eat standing up more often than not, or sitting at the kitchen table with a book propped open against the sugar bowl, which is not a rule anyone taught you but one you arrived at yourself. Today, it will be tomato soup from the can and crackers, which you will heat and eat in approximately 11 minutes, and then you will wash the bowl and the small saucepan and put them away and go down to start the laundry, and the kitchen will be clean again before noon. The soup question is itself a system. Campbell's tomato soup prepared with milk rather than water, which makes it thicker and richer, and which your children prefer when they are home for lunch in summer, and which you prefer yourself, and which your husband prefers on Saturdays when he stays home for lunch. And so the half can of milk method has become the method, not because anyone officially decided, but because it was better, and being better was sufficient reason. This is how most of the kitchen rules came to be, not from a cookbook, not from an authority, but from the quiet accumulation of what worked versus what did not, tested and adjusted and refined over years of daily use until the kitchen ran the way a well-made watch runs, everything in its place, everything serving its purpose, the whole apparatus so internalized that you stop seeing the machinery and only feel the result. There is a rule about the stove that involves knowing it the way you know a person. You know that the front left burner runs slightly hot, that if a recipe says medium you use slightly below medium on that burner, that the oven temperature dial runs 10 degrees warm, and so 400 means 390, that the broiler takes 4 minutes to reach proper heat, and not 3, that the particular smell of the pilot light is different from the smell of the gas when something is wrong, and that you should be able to tell the difference, and you can. A stove has a personality. A kitchen has a personality. You have learned this one over 11 years, and the learning has been so complete that you and the kitchen have a kind of agreement, an understanding that is not quite affection, but is something close to it. By 10 o'clock, you have finished the grocery list and started the first load of laundry, and made a note about the vanilla, and thought through Thursday's dinner, and decided on Friday's baking, and wiped down the stovetop from this morning, and taken the butter out of the refrigerator to soften for the cookies you're going to make. Not today, but tomorrow, because the butter needs to be soft and soft. Butter on a cold morning takes longer than you have, and so the preparation for tomorrow's baking begins today, which is how it always works in this kitchen, where every action is already partially the next action, where the present and the future are always running on the same track. You stand in the kitchen again, briefly, between tasks, and you notice the light coming through the window above the sink, the particular quality of late morning October light that lands on the yellow walls and makes the whole room warmer than it actually is, and the percolator is still faintly warm on the stove though. The coffee inside it has long since crossed the line from fresh to merely hot, and the dish rack by the sink is empty, every glass in its cabinet, every plate in its place, and the kitchen is clean and organised and functioning. And this is your work, and it is real work, and nobody who does not do it understands exactly how real. But you do not need them to understand because you have the evidence all around you, in the smoothly running morning, in the fed and departed family in the kitchen that looks effortless because you have made it so, which is the oldest magic trick in the domestic book. The afternoon will bring its own demands. The laundry will need to be moved from wash to rinse to wring and then carried up the stairs to hang on the line if the weather holds, and the line is outside in the October air, and the sheets will smell like cold and sunlight when they come in, which is one of the small genuine pleasures of this work, one the magazines show accurately if not completely honestly, because they show the sheets and they show the smile, but they do not show the 2 trips up the stairs carrying a basket that weighs more than you expected it to every single time. After the laundry, there will be the afternoon's cooking preparation to begin, and the children will come home at 3:15 and want something from the kitchen, and then dinner will approach with its usual combination of familiarity and logistics, and then the evening, and then the dishes, and then tomorrow, which will begin at 5:45 with the alarm that does not apologise. But right now, in the 10:30 lull, in the quiet kitchen with its yellow walls and its morning smells and its clean linoleum, you have a cup of coffee and a window, and the particular satisfaction of knowing that the complicated machine of this household is running precisely as it should. You did that. You do it every day. It is not small, even when it feels invisible, and some part of you, the part that has been doing this long enough to know the difference, understands that. The afternoon dinner preparation begins with the thaw, which is not a metaphor. The pork chops have been in the refrigerator since Sunday when you moved them from the freezer, which is the correct way to do it, because thawing on the counter is something you were taught not to do, and which you do not do, because bacteria are real, and you understand this in a practical sense that has nothing to do with the word bacteria, and everything to do with the memory of what happened to a neighbour's family one August and how that summer smelled. So the pork chops are in the refrigerator, and they are thawed and ready, and they will be dredged in seasoned flour and browned in the cast iron, and then finished in the oven with a can of cream of mushroom soup poured over them, which is not fancy and was never meant to be, which is the point of it. The point being, dinner at 6 that 4 people will eat without complaint, which is a success so complete it almost never gets named. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. You begin the afternoon's work at 2 o'clock. You set the potatoes to boil, which you will mash for dinner, and while they boil you set the table, which is another unwritten rule. The table is set before the children come home, because setting it while they are underfoot is harder than setting it before, and because a set table when they arrive says something about the evening that has already been decided, that dinner is coming, that the household is in order, that some things can be counted on. You fold the napkins into their rings, the ones with the small engraved initials that were a wedding gift, and which your mother thought were impractical, and which have in fact been used twice daily for 11 years. The napkins are folded in thirds and then in half and then slid through the rings, and it takes approximately 30 seconds, and it has taken approximately 30 seconds every evening for 11 years, which is a number of seconds that adds up to a number of hours you have chosen not to calculate. Your daughter comes home at 3:15 and goes directly to the kitchen, which they all do, which is the animal instinct of children in the direction of food after a school day, and she opens the refrigerator and you tell her there are apples in the bowl on the counter, and she takes an apple and stands eating it at the counter watching you work, which she has done since she was small enough that you had to bring a step stool to the counter for her to see over, and which she does now at 9 with a self-possession that still occasionally surprises you. She tells you about her day, which involves a girl named Patricia, who she has strong opinions about, and you listen and you respond, and you continue dicing the onion for the green beans, and this is what is sometimes called multitasking, but which is really just Tuesday, just being 2 things at once in the way mothers have always been 2 things at once, present and working, listening and doing, entirely attentive and entirely occupied. Your son arrives 12 minutes later and goes directly through the kitchen without stopping, which is what he does because he is 10, and 10 is the age where you're briefly too old for the kitchen and too young for wherever else you're trying to get to. You call after him that there are apples, and he says he knows, and you hear him go upstairs, and then it is just you and your daughter, and the sound of the potatoes beginning to get ready, and the smell of the onions softening in the butter, which is one of the smells of this kitchen that you have never quite gotten over loving, even after years of making it, even now. The smell of onion in butter means dinner is coming. Dinner coming means the evening is organised. The evening being organised means you did your job. You always do your job. The pork chops go into the oven at 4:30, and the kitchen enters its dinner hour, which has its own particular quality. The smells layering over each other, the heat from the oven warming the room beyond the October baseline. The radio on now because you turned it on at 4 o'clock, which is when you always turn it on. A newscast first and then the late afternoon programme that you listen to while you cook, and which your husband disapproves of in a mild, performative way that has no actual effect on whether you listen. You listen. The potatoes are mashed with butter and a little cream and salt, and you taste them from the wooden spoon and add a bit more salt and taste again, because tasting is the only real quality control available to you in this kitchen, and you do it constantly, unself-consciously, as naturally as breathing. The rule about seasoning, which no cookbook has ever stated clearly enough, is that you season throughout and not at the end. You season the flour before the pork chops go into it. You season the water before the potatoes go into it. You salt the butter before the onions go into it. Seasoning at the end of cooking is corrective, and correction is always less effective than intention, which is the kind of observation that sounds like wisdom, and is actually just what 11 years of cooking dinner every night produces in a person, if they are paying any attention at all. Dinner is at 6, not 6:15, not 6:30. 6. The rule about dinner time is not written in any book because it does not need to be written down, because everyone in this household knows it. because it has been 6 o'clock since before they could read a clock, because dinner at 6 is part of the architecture of the day, in the same way that breakfast at 6:30 and school at 8:15, and bedtime at 8:30 for the younger one, and 9 for the older one are part of the architecture of the day, and the architecture is what makes it a day instead of a collection of hours that happen to contain the same people. Your husband is home at 5:45, which is his time, which has been his time since he started at the firm, which is a fact of the household as fixed as the stove. He takes off his hat at the door and hangs his coat and comes into the kitchen, and he says it smells good in here, which he says at least 4 evenings out of 5, and which you receive without comment because it is meant well, and it is not incorrect. It does smell good, you made it smell good, and the acknowledgement, incomplete as it is still something. At the table your family eats. Pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans with the onion and the butter, bread in the bread basket with the blue cloth liner, butter in the butter dish, milk for the children, coffee for the adults, the apple pie from Sunday still on the counter in case anyone wants dessert. The conversation covers school and the day and something your husband read in the paper, and something your son knows about trains, and something your daughter has decided about Patricia. You eat, and you listen, and you serve seconds, and you are present in all the ways that presence requires, which is a great many ways, and you have been present since 5:45 this morning, which is now 13 hours ago, and the day is not quite finished. After dinner, the dishes take 22 minutes. You know this because you have timed it, not with a watch, but with the internal clock that develops in anyone who does the same task with sufficient regularity. The clock that tells you how long things take to the nearest 5 minutes without consulting anything. 22 minutes for 4 people's dinner dishes. The pots take another 7. The stove gets wiped, the counters wiped, the kitchen restored to its baseline clean, and then you hang the dish towel and you turn off the kitchen light and you go and sit in the living room for the first time today at 8:15, which is when you always sit down, which is when the day releases you, or close enough to releasing you that it amounts to the same thing. You sit and you do not think about the kitchen, exactly, but it is there behind everything the way it is always there. The clean room waiting for tomorrow, the inventory you took this morning, the bread you will bake on Friday, the vanilla that needs replacing, the copper pot that wants polishing, the small fraying of the toaster cord. It is all there, the whole running apparatus of the household, held in your head with the same thoroughness and care as any job you could name, and producing results that anyone in this house takes for granted, and that you have made so reliable that the taking for granted is almost a kind of tribute, almost a proof of how well it works, even if it is not quite the tribute you would have chosen. You reach for your book, the house is quiet, the children are in bed, your husband is reading the paper, the coffee is long since cold, and tomorrow begins at 5:45. The rule about bread has a corollary, which is the rule about baking in general, and the rule about baking is that it requires a different relationship to time than the other kitchen tasks. Cooking dinner is responsive. You respond to what is there, what needs to be done, what the available ingredients and the available hour will support. Baking is predictive. You cannot respond to bread that has not risen properly. You cannot correct a cake that went into the oven before the butter was properly creamed. Baking requires that you know what you're going to do before you begin it, which means that the preparation for Friday's bread begins on Thursday, when you take the yeast from the pantry shelf and check that it is still good, which you can tell by the smell, and on Thursday evening when you set the shortening and the eggs at room temperature, and on Friday morning when the timing of the day's other tasks is arranged to accommodate the 2 hours the bread will need to rise. You know the recipe from memory, which means you do not consult it, which means the book stays on the shelf, which means the recipe exists entirely in your hands and your body's sense of what the dough should feel like, and this is the most advanced form of culinary knowledge, the form that cannot be communicated by a book no matter how well written, that can only be learned by repetition so complete that the feedback loop between your hands and your understanding of what you are doing becomes instantaneous and invisible. You know what properly developed dough feels like. You know the difference between dough that is ready to rest and dough that needs 3 more minutes of kneading. You know it the way you know the difference between your husband's footstep on the stairs and your son's, not by thinking about it, but by recognizing it instantly and correctly, 100 times in a row, without error. The kneading itself is physical work in a way that is different from the other physical work of the kitchen. It requires the whole upper body, the arms and the shoulders and the weight shifting forward on the balls of your feet as you push the heel of your hand into the dough and fold it back and push again. And there is something in the rhythm of it that is different from the rhythm of washing dishes or sweeping the floor, something that occupies the body completely enough that the mind can go somewhere else for the duration, can drift into whatever it wants to think about while the hands do what they have always done. Some mornings you think about nothing at all. Some mornings the mind goes to things that are worth thinking about. Your daughter's plans, the conversation you had with Fern last Friday, the letter you owe your mother, the question of whether to repaint the kitchen yellow again or try the green your husband suggested and you have not yet decided about. The kneading gives the mind permission to wander, which is a rarer permission than it should be in a day that is otherwise mostly responsive, mostly attending to what is needed right now. The bread goes into the bowl to rise covered with a clean dish towel, in the warmest corner of the kitchen, which in October is the corner near the stove, and you leave it and go and do the other things the morning requires, and when you come back an hour later the dough has doubled and the towel is slightly warm, and the smell is the smell of yeast and flour and something else that is not quite either of those, something that is the smell of what happens when living things do what they are supposed to do. You punch it down, you shape it. It goes into the loaf pans and rises again, then the oven, and then the weight, and then the sound of a hollow knock when you tap the bottom of the loaf, which tells you it is done, and you set it on the rack to cool and you resist cutting into it for at least 20 minutes, because the bread needs that time to finish what the oven started, and cutting it too early compresses the crumb and wastes what the rising accomplished. You know all of this. You know it absolutely. It is knowledge you have built over years through attention and repetition, an occasional failure from which you learned what the failure was and adjusted. This is what expertise looks like from the inside. Not certainty, not the absence of things going wrong, but the increasing reliability of your own judgment about what is happening and what to do about it. You have had bread that did not rise, bread that rose too fast and then collapsed, bread that came out of the oven pale when it should have been golden, bread that was dense when it should have been light. Every one of those failures told you something specific, and you adjusted specifically, and eventually the failures became rare and then rarer, and now they are occasional, and when they happen, you know within minutes why, and knowing why is enough. The kitchen rewards this kind of sustained attention in a way that is quiet and reliable and entirely private. Nobody sees the learning, nobody sees the adjustment, nobody notices the bread that turned out better this week than it did last month. What they notice is that the bread is good, and the bread is good because of what you know, and what you know is yours, and even in a life where a great deal of what you produce disappears into the people who eat it, and the clean floors and the organised refrigerator and the smoothly running week, the knowledge stays. The knowledge is yours permanently and cannot be consumed or misplaced or borrowed without credit and not returned. It lives in your hands, and it will be there tomorrow morning when you need it. There is a rule about the kitchen that involves the time of 4 in the afternoon, which is the hour the kitchen shifts from afternoon mode into dinner preparation mode, and which is also the hour the children are arriving home, and the husband is not yet home, and the light is changing in the window and the day is beginning to gather itself toward its end. 4 o'clock in the kitchen is a transitional hour, and you have learned to manage the transition deliberately, not to let the afternoon tasks bleed into the dinner tasks without a clear break, because the break matters, because it is the mechanism by which you shift gears, by which the mental space that was holding the laundry count and the grocery list and the bread timing is cleared and reloaded with the menu for tonight, and the sequence of its preparation, and the timing that will bring everything to the table simultaneously at 6. The simultaneous arrival of everything at the table at 6 is perhaps the most technically demanding thing a kitchen requires. The meat must be done when the potatoes are done, when the vegetable is done, when the bread is warm and the butter is softened and the table is set and the family is seated, all of this converging at a single moment, which requires backward planning from 6 o'clock through every step of the preparation, an understanding of how long each element takes and how they can be timed to come together, which is a form of project management that is entirely accurate to the term, even if it is not a term anyone applied to it at the time. You do it without a schedule, without a clock you consult repeatedly, without anything written down. You do it by feel and by the internal timer that has been calibrating itself for 11 years and is now accurate enough that the dinner arrives at 6, not 6:07, not 5:58, at 6. And if you are asked how you know when to start what, You will pause before answering because the knowledge has become so internal that explaining it is almost like explaining how you know which foot to use on stairs. There is also the rule about mistakes in the kitchen, which is that you do not announce them. If something is oversalted, you add more potato to absorb the salt. If something is underseasoned, you correct it at the table where the salt shaker lives and can be used without comment. If the gravy is lumpy, you strain it before it comes to the table, or you adjust its texture with a whisk and patience, and an understanding that lumpy gravy becomes smooth gravy if you have 15 minutes and some milk and the willingness to keep working it. The rule is not that mistakes do not happen. It is that what appears on the table is the corrected version, the finished version, the version that the family encounters, and the distance between the mistake and the correction is yours to manage and yours alone. This is not deception, it is craft. The finished painting does not show the sketch beneath it, but the sketch was necessary, and the painter who painted over her corrections and produced a smooth finished surface did something real. There is a thread connecting the kitchen we have just lived through to a book on a shelf in the living room, a book with a red cover and a name printed in tall letters, and a first edition that came out in 1931 and has not been out of print since. The Joy of Cooking. And the story of how it came to exist is the story of a woman who was not a professional cook, not a food writer, not someone with a publishing contract or a culinary education, or any particular reason to believe that the book she needed to write would find a reader at all, and who wrote it anyway, in a grief so complete it might have stopped someone else entirely. Irma Rombauer was born in St. Louis in 1877 into a German-American family in a city with a strong German-American tradition of food and hospitality, and the table as the centre of family life. She was not, by any description that survives, a woman easily contained. She was social, ambitious in the way that women of her generation were expected not to be, funny in the dry, precise way that makes people laugh when they did not expect to, and deeply attached to her home and to the people inside it in a way that made what came next, in February of 1930, a devastation of a particular order. Her husband, Edgar Rombauer, a lawyer in St. Louis, died by suicide in their bedroom on a February evening. Irma was 52 years old. The depression had arrived with full force. The money that had sustained their life, the investments and the savings and the particular financial scaffolding of a comfortable middle-class existence had been significantly reduced. And in the immediate aftermath of Edgar's death, Irma found herself in a situation that was at once the most private and most practical kind of crisis. She needed to find a way to live, financially and otherwise, and she needed to find it quickly. What she did was write a cookbook, not because she was told to, not because the market demanded it, not because a publisher approached her, because her friends and her daughters asked her, repeatedly, to write down what she knew about cooking. Because the people who came to her table wanted to replicate what they ate there. Because Irma had a gift for explaining things that were commonly taken for granted in a way that made them suddenly comprehensible to people who had not been taught, or who had been taught badly, or who had been taught in a language that assumed they already knew everything they were trying to learn. She self-published The Joy of Cooking in 1931. She paid for it herself. She hired an artist to illustrate it. She arranged the distribution herself, largely through a local bookstore and through word of mouth among the St. Louis social world that knew her. The first printing was 3,000 copies. She signed them herself, individually, and she sold them, and the response was enough to suggest that what she had made was something people needed, rather than something they merely wanted. The book found its readers because it was doing something that existing cookbooks were not quite doing. It was talking to the actual woman in the actual kitchen, not to the idealized cook who already knew everything, not to the trained professional, not to the woman who'd been cooking for 30 years and needed only a recipe. It was talking to the woman who needed to know why, and not just how, who needed the recipe to explain itself while it instructed, who needed to feel that the person on the other side of the page was a friend who happened to know more and was not particularly interested in making her feel the difference. Irma's voice on the page was direct and warm and slightly wry and entirely herself. She wrote about food the way she talked about it, with affection and specificity, and the occasional aside that landed like something she had been keeping to herself and had finally decided to say. She was not solemn about cooking. She did not treat the kitchen as a sacred space or the meal as a religious act, though she understood exactly what a good meal could do for the people who shared it. She treated cooking as a craft that could be learned by almost anyone willing to pay attention, and she taught it as if she genuinely believed that to be true. The Bobbs Merrill Publishing House acquired the book in 1936 and published a revised edition that reached a national audience. This was the beginning of the joy of cooking as most people came to know it, though the book they knew would continue to change through multiple editions over the following decades. Irma revised it substantially in 1943 and again in 1946. Her daughter Marion Rombauer Becker, who had been involved in various ways from early on, eventually became her co-author and ultimately the primary keeper of the book after Irma's death in 1962. The relationship between Irma and Marion, and between the two women and the book, is one of the more complicated and interesting stories in American publishing history, because it was a collaboration in the deepest sense, not just of labour, but of vision, and the two women did not always share the same vision, and the book changed depending on which of them was more fully in charge at any given moment. Irma's version of the book was warmer, more conversational, more interested in the experience of cooking as a social and emotional act. Marion's version was more systematic, more technically precise, more interested in nutrition and in the science underneath the recipe. Neither version was wrong. They were expressions of two different but equally serious relationships to food and to the kitchen. What made the book essential in American kitchens was not just its recipes, though the recipes were good and reliable and carefully worked out. It was the structure. Irma pioneered a format that put the recipe ingredients inside the instructions, rather than in a separate list at the top, which sounds like a small decision, and was in fact a revolution in how cookbooks communicated with their readers. When you read a recipe from Joy of Cooking, the ingredient appears in the sentence at the moment you need it, which is how cooking actually works, which is how a more experienced cook would explain a recipe to a less experienced one. You add a cup of flour now, you add the butter now, the timing and the quantity arrive together. This format, which later became common enough to seem obvious, was Irma's invention, and it came from her instinct as a teacher rather than her instinct as a writer, from her understanding of what the person in the kitchen actually needed to know, and when they needed to know it. The book sold through the Depression years not because people had money to buy cookbooks, but because people needed to cook differently than they had before, needed to stretch further and waste less and find ways to make satisfying meals from diminished pantries, and The Joy of Cooking was one of the books that helped them do it. This was not Irma's primary intention, but it was the effect, because a book that teaches you the underlying principles of cooking, rather than simply handing you a sequence of steps, is a book that can adapt to whatever you have on hand, and adapting to whatever you have on hand is exactly what Depression cooking required. During the Second World War, the book became something different again. Rationing imposed new constraints on American kitchens, and Irma's 1943 revision addressed this with the directness that her readers appreciated. She wrote about substitutions and alternatives, and the way to maintain the spirit of a recipe when the letter of it was impossible to follow, which was the practical wisdom of a woman who had been cooking under constraint since 1930, and who understood that scarcity does not have to mean surrender. The homefront cook needed to feel that what she was doing was still worth doing, that the diminished ingredients did not diminish the meal or the family it fed, and Irma's book gave her that. Gave her the confidence and the technique to produce something genuinely good, under conditions that were not ideal. The post-war editions of the book entered the kitchens of the women we have just spent the morning with. Those 1950s household managers with their Frigidaires and their cast-iron skillets, and their grocery lists. The Joy of Cooking was on a great many shelves in a great many kitchens, not as a status symbol, not as decoration, but as a working document, used and annotated and stained and repaired with tape at the spine. You can still find copies in that condition today, which is one of the better arguments for the quality of anything, that people used it until it fell apart and then taped it back together and kept using it. What Irma had built was something that became part of the domestic infrastructure of American life, in a way that few objects achieve. Not everyone had the same stove or the same refrigerator or the same patterns on their linoleum, but a great many of them had the same red-covered book and the same voice inside it, talking to them across the table with the warmth and specificity of someone who cooked for people she loved and wanted to teach you how to do the same. Irma did not profit from the book's success in the way that anyone who saw the sales figures might have expected. Her relationship with her publisher was complicated, and the financial arrangements of her original contract were not what she would have chosen had she known what the book would become. There were disputes and renegotiations and a dynamic between the author and the publishing house that reflected the broader difficulty women had in the mid-20th century when they possessed something of real value and tried to negotiate for a fair return on it. She did not stop writing. She did not stop revising. She continued to be present in the book through successive editions, her voice surviving even as the text changed around it, the particular quality of her attention to the person in the kitchen remaining constant even as the kitchens themselves evolved. She died in 1962 in Cincinnati at 84, having spent the last 30 years of her life in the continuous service of a book she'd created out of grief and necessity and the particular genius of knowing what the woman at the stove actually needed to hear. Her daughter Marion continued the work, and the 1975 edition, published after years of Marion's careful revision, became in many ways the most fully realised version of what the two women had been building together, a book that honoured Irma's conversational warmth while expanding the technical and nutritional scope that Marion believed the modern cook deserved. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. The Joy of Cooking is still in print. It has never gone out of print. It has sold tens of millions of copies. It has been in kitchens that Irma Rombauer could not have imagined, in homes in every American city and in countries she never visited, translated into languages she did not speak. And none of that, impressive as it is quite the point. The point is what happened in the kitchen on a Monday morning in October, when a woman with a grocery list and a cast iron skillet and a full week ahead of her opened the red book to the recipe she needed and found, waiting for her there. A voice that spoke to her directly and without condescension, and with the kind of respect that comes from truly understanding what the work involves. That voice was Irma Rombauer's, and it has been in the kitchen with her readers every morning for more than 90 years. There is more to say about the cookbook world that surrounded The Joy of Cooking, because no book exists in isolation, and no kitchen rule is invented in a single kitchen, and the story of American domestic cooking in the mid-20th century is also the story of who was trying to teach it and why and to whom, and with what particular agenda running underneath the instruction. The settlement house movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had produced a generation of women who believed, with genuine conviction, that teaching cooking was a form of social uplift, that the kitchen was a moral as well as a practical space, and that improving the quality of home cooking would improve the quality of American life from the ground up. This belief produced home economics as a formal discipline, which produced home economics teachers, which produced a particular kind of cookbook that was less concerned with pleasure than with correct procedure and the moral weight of waste reduction and proper nutrition. The Fanny Farmer Cookbook, which came out in 1896 and remained enormously influential through the first half of the 20th century, was the great monument of this tradition. Fanny Merritt Farmer, who ran the Boston Cooking School, standardized measurements in American recipes, replacing the pinch and the teacup and the handful with the level measuring cup and the precise tablespoon. This was a genuine contribution to reproducibility in cooking, the idea that if a recipe specifies exact quantities, it can be replicated by anyone who follows those quantities, regardless of the size of their hand or the capacity of their particular teacup. But it was also, in its precision and its manner, a document of a different relationship to the kitchen than Irma Rombauer's. Fanny Farmer taught. Irma Rombauer conversed. Both approaches found their readers, and both shaped what women in American kitchens understood about their work and about themselves. The Better Homes and Gardens. Cookbook arrived in 1930 and sold in enormous quantities through the 30s and 40s, eventually becoming one of the best-selling cookbooks in American history. It was put out by the magazine of the same name, and it had the particular quality of a trusted institution, authoritative, cheerful, solidly reliable, and entirely in keeping with the magazine's vision of American domestic life, as a project that could be perfected through the right products and the right techniques applied with sufficient industry. The Better Homes and Gardens. Cookbook was the cookbook of the post-war suburban kitchen, in a way that was different from The Joy of Cooking, which was the cookbook of the cook who wanted to understand. The Better Homes and Gardens. Cookbook was the cookbook of the cook who wanted to succeed, and in that distinction lies a great deal about the culture that produced both of them. There was also the tradition of the charity cookbook, The volumes put out by women's clubs and church groups and auxiliary organisations and settlement houses, in which recipes were contributed by members and compiled by a committee, and sold at fundraisers and given as gifts and used in actual kitchens more than almost any other cookbook produced in America. These books are not famous. They have no single author whose story can be told. They survive in boxes in attics and in the back shelves of used bookstores, their spines broken, their pages annotated in pencil, their covers stained with the materials of actual cooking. And they represent collectively a vast body of practical knowledge about what American women actually cooked and how they actually did it, knowledge that was transmitted not from a cooking school or a magazine editorial board, but from neighbour to neighbour and mother to daughter and friend to friend across the fence at the back of the yard. The Jell-O recipe booklets that came with every box of Jell-O, the pamphlets produced by Crisco and by Caro corn syrup and by the makers of every major kitchen product, the church women's auxiliaries that compiled their recipes into mimeographed sheets, stapled together and sold for $1 at the spring bazaar, the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, and the recipes tested by the Good Housekeeping test kitchens and published in the magazine and reproduced on index cards in kitchen drawers across the country. All of this was part of the ecosystem of instruction within which the mid-century kitchen operated, a layered and partially overlapping set of authorities and traditions and voices, telling women how to cook and what to cook and why, and occasionally contradicting each other in interesting ways. Amid all of this, what Irma Rombauer gave her readers was something that the authoritative voices could not quite provide, which was permission. Permission to enjoy it, permission to adapt, permission to taste as you go and trust your own judgment, and find the version of the recipe that works in your kitchen with your equipment and your family's preferences, rather than the version that exists in the abstract perfection of a test kitchen in New York. That kind of permission was not easily given in a culinary culture that often treated the recipe as law, and the cook's deviation from it as failure. Irma treated the recipe as a starting point, and the cook as someone capable of taking it somewhere interesting, and that respect, simple as it sounds, was rarer than it should have been. The red book on the shelf in the living room carries all of that history in its pages. Every recipe that worked for 11 years and became part of the muscle memory of a kitchen carries it. Every annotation in the margin, every stained page, every spine repaired with tape is evidence of a conversation between a woman who understood what the work required and a woman doing the work. And the conversation went on long enough and ran deep enough that the two of them are still, in some fundamental sense, in the kitchen together. The story of food in mid-century America is also a story of transformation so rapid it was difficult to track from inside it. In the span of roughly 2 decades, from the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s, the American kitchen was reshaped by a combination of new technologies, new products, new marketing strategies, and new social conditions that collectively changed not just what people cooked, but what they believed cooking was for and what they believed it said about them. Refrigeration, which had existed in various forms since the early 20th century, but became widespread in American homes during the 1930s and 40s, changed everything about how food was stored, purchased, and planned. Before reliable home refrigeration, the daily trip to the market was a necessity, not a preference. With refrigeration, the weekly shopping trip became possible, and the grocery list as a planning document became the central organizing artifact of the household kitchen. The refrigerator did not just preserve food, it changed the temporal structure of domestic life, extending the planning horizon from today to the whole week ahead, and making the woman who planned that week's meals into a kind of household logistician whose skills were real and demanding even as they were consistently under-acknowledged. The canned food industry, which had grown steadily since the late 19th century, reached its full influence in American kitchens during the Depression and the war years, and then expanded dramatically in the post-war period. Campbell's soup, Del Monte fruits and vegetables, Heinz condiments, the full range of Libby's canned goods, all of these were in the pantries of the kitchens we have been visiting, not as substitutes for something better, but as reliable components of a working kitchen's repertoire, understood and used with the same familiarity as any other staple. The cream of mushroom soup that went over the pork chops was not a shortcut, not in the way that word implies something lesser. It was a technique, tested and refined over years of use in actual households, producing results that 4 people ate with satisfaction 6 evenings a week in kitchens all over the country. The convenience food revolution, which began to accelerate in the early 1950s, would eventually reshape all of this, would push toward the TV dinner and the packaged cake mix and the frozen vegetable that replaced the canned one, and then toward everything that followed. But in the kitchen we spent this morning in, that revolution was still arriving rather than fully arrived, still presenting itself as possibility rather than replacement, and the woman making breakfast from eggs she took out of the refrigerator the night before and bacon from a paper-wrapped package from the butcher counter at the A&P was still, primarily, a cook in the traditional sense, a person who transformed raw ingredients into meals through knowledge and skill and time and daily attention. That would change. It was already changing. But the morning we spent in that kitchen, the specific October morning in the mid-1950s with the yellow walls and the cast-iron skillet and the grocery list in the notepad drawer, belongs to the last years of one way of cooking before another took its place. And the red book on the shelf, with Irma's voice inside it talking directly to whoever stood at that stove, was one of the things that made the transition possible, that gave the women moving between these two versions of the American kitchen enough confidence in their own judgment to navigate the change without losing what they knew. What they knew was considerable. What they knew is what we spent the morning learning, and it is worth saying plainly before we move on, the woman at that stove was doing something that required real intelligence, real skill, real sustained attention, and real organizational capacity, and she was doing it every day, largely without acknowledgement, inside a culture that was actively and simultaneously celebrating her domestic role and pretending that the role required very little of her. That gap between the celebration and the pretense is a subject we will come back to before the night is over. But first, there is another kitchen to visit, a different kind of kitchen, one that was not a room in a house but a space in a farmhouse parlor in rural Wisconsin or downstate Illinois or the red clay hills of Georgia, wherever the county extension service sent its agents, wherever women needed to learn what the schools had not taught them, and the mothers had not had time to explain, and the neighbors did not know either, wherever a woman named something like Dorothy or Evelyn or Louise arrived in a car with a sample kit and a plan, and a genuine belief that what she was about to teach was going to make a real difference in real lives. She was usually right. The story of what happened between Irma Rombauer and her publisher deserves more than a passing mention, because it is not primarily a publishing story. It is a story about what happens when a woman creates something of significant value and then negotiates for that value inside systems that were not designed to treat her as an equal party to the negotiation. Irma's relationship with Bobbs Merrill, the Indianapolis publishing house that acquired The Joy of Cooking in 1936, was complicated almost from the beginning, and the complications increased as the book's success became increasingly undeniable, and the financial terms of the original contract became increasingly inadequate to reflect that success. Irma had sold a large portion of her rights in the book for what seemed a reasonable arrangement at the time of the sale, but which was revised upward only through sustained effort on her part, and on the part of her daughter, Marion, who became increasingly involved in advocating for better terms as the years went on. The publisher, for its part, was doing what publishers of that era typically did, offering the standard terms, negotiating to its advantage, and being slow to revise arrangements that benefited it. What made this situation particular was the scale of the book's success relative to the recognition and compensation the author received for it. The book was selling in numbers that made it one of the best-selling cookbooks in American history, and Irma was not becoming wealthy from it in the way those numbers might suggest she should. This gap between the success of the work and the financial return to its creator was not unusual for the time, especially for women creators, who had less experience with contract negotiation and fewer professional networks through which to understand what a fair arrangement might look like, and who often found themselves at a disadvantage in dealings with publishing houses that had staff lawyers and decades of accumulated negotiating experience. Irma navigated this with the same combination of intelligence and persistence that characterized the rest of her life, and the arrangements improved over time, but the improvement came slowly and required constant attention. Marion Becker's role in the book's history is itself a significant story that tends to be overshadowed by Irma's, partly because Marion worked for so many years in a supporting role, and partly because Marion's contributions, which were substantial, and which shaped the book in ways that readers experienced directly, were not always credited in ways proportionate to their importance. Marion was deeply invested in expanding the book's coverage of nutrition, which she understood as a matter of public health, rather than mere domestic information, and in improving the scientific accuracy of the explanations behind the recipes. She wanted the reader to understand the chemistry of what they were doing as well as the procedure, to know why the baking soda was reacting with the buttermilk and not just that you added both to the bowl. This commitment to the underlying science made Marian's contributions different in character from Irma's, and the tension between Irma's conversational warmth and Marian's technical precision was a creative tension that ran through multiple editions of the book and ultimately produced something richer than either woman might have created alone. The best moments in The Joy of Cooking sit at the intersection of those two qualities, the explanation that is both accurate and welcoming, that tells you what is happening and why in terms that make the information feel like a gift rather than an obligation. When Marian published the 1975 edition, the major revision she'd been working toward for years, it was received as a monument of American cookbook writing, a thorough and comprehensive document of the culinary knowledge of its time. It sold enormously. It was the version that many people in the 1970s and 80s and 90s came to know as the authoritative Joy of Cooking. Marian died in 1976, the year after its publication, having seen the book she had devoted so many years to reach the form she believed it deserved. The history of the book after Marian's death is a history of Irma's grandchildren and their own relationship to the work their grandmother and great-aunt had built, and of the decisions about revision and update that any long-lived book must eventually face. The 1997 edition, revised by Ethan Becker, was a substantial departure from Marian's version in ways that generated significant discussion about what the book was and what it was for. A later edition returned to a version closer to Marian's in spirit. The book has continued to be revised and republished and debated, which is itself a form of tribute. Only books that matter are worth fighting over. What remains constant across all editions is the voice, or rather the trace of the voice, the quality of attention that Irma Rombauer brought to the person standing at the stove, the sense that the instructions on the page have been written by someone who has stood in the same position and knows what you need and is not going to make you feel foolish for needing it. That voice has survived editions and decades, and the deaths of its originators, and the changing of American kitchens beyond anything Irma could have anticipated when she sat down to write after Edgar died in 1930. It has survived because it reflects something true about the relationship between cooking and trust, about the way a kitchen works best when the person inside it believes in their own competence, and about how much a voice on a page can contribute to that belief. The Joy of Cooking is not the only book that did this. There are other voices in other books that gave other women the same gift of confidence and permission, but it is the one that did it first, at the moment when it was most needed, in the voice of a woman who understood from her own life that you sometimes have to begin again in difficult circumstances, and that the kitchen is a place where beginning again is always possible, where every morning the stove is cold and the pot is empty and everything that happens next is a choice you make with what you have. You have been up since before 6, which is not unusual, because the people you will visit today have been up since before 6 as well, and you have learned over 3 years in this job that arriving early matters, that arriving early is part of how you tell a farm family that you respect their time, that you understand their days do not organise themselves around the convenience of visitors. Your car, a 1949 Ford that the county maintains but which you drive as if it is your own because you spend more time in it than anywhere else, is already loaded. The sample kit is in the back seat. The glass jars and the lid wrenches and the rubber rings are in the trunk in a wooden crate your husband built for exactly this purpose without being asked, which is one of the things you know about him. The demonstration booklets from the extension service are in the briefcase on the passenger seat. You have done this drive so many times that your hands know the turns before your eyes register them. You are a home demonstration agent for your county, which is a job that most people outside the agricultural community cannot easily picture, and which most people inside the agricultural community take entirely for granted, which is its own kind of recognition. The Cooperative Extension Service, which operates through a partnership between the federal government, the land-grant universities, and the individual counties, has been sending women like you into rural homes since the early years of the 20th century. The agricultural agents, who are nearly always men, work with the farmers on crop yields and soil management and livestock. You work with the farm women on everything else: food preservation, nutrition, sewing, home management, child health, household budgeting. everything that happens inside the farmhouse is, in some sense, your territory, and you have learned that the territory is vast. Your first visit today is 12 miles out on the county road, a farm family you've been working with since your second month in this job, when you drove out cold and knocked on the door of a woman named Edna Pratt and introduced yourself and told her you were from the Extension Service and you were there to help. And Edna looked at you for a long, measuring moment and said that she had been canning her own beans since she was 14 and did not know what she needed help with. And you said that was exactly what you were hoping to hear, and you asked if you could sit down anyway, and she let you in. And that was the beginning of a working relationship that has now included pressure canner demonstrations, a new approach to bread baking, a series on household accounts, and the quiet conversation last spring about Edna's daughter, who wanted to go to the teachers' college, and whose mother needed someone to tell her that this was possible, financially and practically. And that the Extension Service had information about scholarship programs, and that you would help her find it. That is the job, not just the canning. The canning is the entry point, the trust is the actual work. You pull into the Pratt farm at 8:15, and Edna is already at the kitchen door. She has a pot of coffee on, which she always does when you're coming, and you accept a cup without hesitation, because refusing hospitality from a farm woman is something you learned in your first month not to do. Because hospitality here is not casual. It is an expression of the household's ability to provide, and declining it is a small rejection of what the household is and what the woman who runs it has made. So you drink the coffee, which is strong and good, and you sit at Edna's kitchen table, and you look at the room the way you always do when you arrive somewhere new or revisit somewhere familiar, cataloguing what has changed and what has stayed the same, reading the kitchen for what it tells you about what is needed. Edna's kitchen is bigger than the kitchen we spent this morning in, because farmhouses generally are, and it is organised around the wood-burning range that her mother-in-law brought to the marriage in 1926, and which Edna has been cooking on ever since. She also has an electric hot plate on the counter for smaller tasks, because the range runs hot in summer, and anything that can be done on the hot plate in July is done on the hot plate in July. The canning setup is along the far wall. The pressure canner, large and serious, the water bath canner, the rack for holding jars, the wide-mouth funnel, the jar lifter, the lid wand, and the collection of empty jars in various sizes that represent the summer's work so far, which is substantial. Edna Pratt is a serious canner. She puts up tomatoes and green beans and corn and beets and pickles and fruit and jam and apple butter, and her cellar is the kind of cellar that in a bad winter is not a backup plan but the actual plan, and she knows it, and she takes it seriously. Today you are demonstrating the pressure canner technique for low-acid vegetables, specifically green beans, because pressure canning is the only safe method for low-acid foods, and because botulism is real and has killed people in your county, not recently, but within living memory, and your job is to make sure that the women in the farmhouses in your territory understand why the boiling water bath is not sufficient for green beans, and what the pressure canner is doing and why every step matters, not just as a matter of procedure but as a matter of physics and as a matter of life. You're not alarmist about this, you are matter of fact. You have found that matter of fact is more persuasive than alarm, that women who have been canning for years do not respond well to being told they have been doing it wrong, but that they respond very well to being told that there is a reason the new method works better, and here is what the reason is. You unpack the demonstration materials and set up on Edna's counter, and her daughter Ruth, who is 16, comes in from the barn and washes her hands at the sink without being told, and sits down at the table to watch, which is why Edna invited her to stay home from school today, which is something Edna arranged with the school in advance, and which you understand as a deliberate act of teaching. One woman making sure the next one learns what the next one needs to know. This is how the knowledge has always moved. Not always through the Extension Service, not always through any official channel, sometimes just through a mother and a daughter at a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a glass jar and a pressure canner and the patience to go slowly. The demonstration takes 2 hours. You go through every step, not hurrying, because hurrying is the enemy of this kind of teaching, and because Edna and Ruth deserve the full version, and you have given them enough of your time now that they would notice if you cut it short. You explain the role of heat and pressure in destroying the bacterial spores that survive boiling water, and you explain it in terms that have nothing to do with bacteriology textbooks and everything to do with what actually happens inside the jar. And you show the pressure gauge and explain how to read it, and what to do if it reads wrong. and you explain the proper headspace and why it matters, and how to tell if a seal is formed correctly after the jar cools. Edna nods throughout with the nod of someone who is confirming what she mostly already knows and noting what she did not. Ruth asks 2 questions. They are both good questions. You tell her so, because telling people when their questions are good is part of the work, is part of how you build the confidence that makes people willing to ask more questions and try more things, and believe that their own intelligence is sufficient for what they are being asked to learn. By 10:30, the jars are processing in the canner, and the kitchen is filled with the particular smell of this work, heat and steam and the faint mineral smell of hot glass, and you are sitting at the table with Edna drinking your second cup of coffee and discussing the question of her daughter's college plans, which is the conversation underneath the canning demonstration, the reason Edna wanted Ruth to be there, the thing that needed to happen today in a way that might not happen as easily on another day. You have the scholarship information in your briefcase, which you take out and place on the table between you, and you go through it together, the 3 of you, and Ruth listens with the focused, careful attention of someone who's been hoping for this and was not certain it would be possible. The Extension Service provides you with resources beyond the demonstrations, and one of them is the knowledge of what is available, what the colleges are doing to recruit farm girls, what the loan programs look like, what the costs actually are when you add up what you know about how much a family like the Pratts can realistically commit without compromising the farm's operation. This is not in any demonstration booklet. This is in your head, accumulated through 3 years of conversations at kitchen tables in this county, through the college counsellor at the high school you called in September, through the woman at the land-grant university extension office who handles student inquiries, and who has, over the past year, become someone you call when you need to know something you cannot find in the materials. Your job is officially home demonstration. Your job is actually whatever the woman in front of you needs, within what you can reasonably provide. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. You leave the Pratt farm at 11:15. The jars are cooling on the counter in a row, 12 of them, which is a good morning's work. Ruth has the scholarship application in her hand and a deadline written on the back of an envelope in your handwriting. You say goodbye to Edna at the door and she says she'll see you next month, which means that what happened today was satisfactory, and satisfactory from Edna Pratt is a genuine evaluation. You back down the farm lane and turn onto the county road and drive toward your next appointment, which is 8 miles south and involves a different kind of kitchen and a different kind of need. Your second visit is a farmhouse where the woman is new to this country, having arrived from Hungary 3 years ago with her husband and 2 small children, and settled on a farm her husband's cousin helped them buy. Her name is Catalin, which people around here call Catherine because they find the original difficult, and she speaks English well enough for most purposes but not well enough for the particular English of an official form or a legal document or a county health notice, and so your visits with her have an additional layer. The layer of translation, not just of language but of context, of explaining why certain things are required and what the reason is behind the requirement, and of doing it in a way that does not make her feel that everything she brought with her from Hungary is wrong. This is one of the parts of your job that nobody trained you for directly, though the extension service courses at the university touched on working with immigrant families. What they did not touch on was how to sit at a table with a woman who is proud and competent and fully capable of feeding her family and running her household, and who also does not know what the county health nurse means when she talks about pasteurization, and who needs the information without the implication that her ignorance of it reflects badly on her. You have learned this through making mistakes. You have learned it through the particular expression on Catalin's face in your first 2 visits, when something in your manner said something your words did not intend. You have adjusted. You are still adjusting. Today you are reviewing what Catalin knows about feeding her children, specifically the question of vitamin D and the connection to the milk supply and the school lunch program, and whether her children are enrolled, which they are. You confirmed this last month with the school. But whether Catalin understands what the school lunch program includes and what it costs and how the reduced price option works is something you want to verify, because you have learned that assuming understanding is the fastest way to leave a gap in it. You sit at Catalin's table, which is covered with an embroidered cloth you have admired before, and which she made herself from a pattern she brought from Hungary. The kitchen smells different from Edna's kitchen, different spices, a kind of paprika that is not the same as the paprika in most American kitchens, something richer and darker and more insistent. There is a pot on the stove that contains something you do not recognize, but which smells extraordinarily good. You ask about it and Catalin explains, partly in English and partly with her hands, and you understand enough to know that it is a chicken dish with peppers and that her mother made it every Sunday. You write down, in your notes for this visit, that Catalin's traditional cooking knowledge is extensive and should not be treated as a deficit. You write this because you want to remember it, and because you want whoever reads your notes after you to know it. The conversation about school lunch takes 20 minutes and resolves in a way that is satisfactory. The children are enrolled, and the cost is manageable, and Catalin understands what the program includes. You also, while you're there, go through the county health nurse's notice about the upcoming well-child clinic which Catalin received in the mail and has been looking at with the suspicion that documents in unfamiliar English deserve, and you explain it, and she nods, and she marks the date on the calendar on the kitchen wall, which has photographs of the Hungarian countryside on it, and which has, in the squares for each day, a careful record of what she has cooked, because she's tracking what her family eats, tracking it in the methodical way of someone who grew up in circumstances where you could not afford not to know. You leave Catalin's farm at 12:45. You sit in the car for a moment before starting it, the way you do between visits when you need a few minutes to shift from one household's particular reality to the next one's. This is not a practice anyone told you to develop. It is something you arrived at out of necessity, because going directly from Edna's situation to Catalin's situation, to whatever is waiting for you at the next stop without any pause, means arriving at each place still carrying the previous one, and the previous one does not belong at the next table. Each woman deserves your full attention. You sit in the car for 5 minutes and eat the sandwich from your bag and look at the fields. The afternoon brings 2 more visits, and then the county agent meeting at 4:30, which is the meeting between the home demonstration agents and the agricultural extension agents at the county office, and which takes place in a room that is entirely aware of which side of the table has the professional standing and which side is still considered supplementary. You have been to 40 of these meetings approximately, and the dynamic is familiar. The agricultural agents talk about acreage and yield and market prices and machinery, and the home demonstration agents talk about nutrition programs and canning records and the new curriculum from the state university on household budgeting, and the meeting runs until 6 and then everyone goes home, and the things the agricultural agents discussed will appear in the county report and in the state extension newsletter, and the things the home demonstration agents discussed will appear in the column-headed homemaking news, if there is space. You're not bitter about this. You are aware of it, which is different. The work you do is real and its results are measurable, and you have measured them. The family in the northeast corner of the county that is eating more vegetables this year than last because you introduced them to succession planting in their kitchen garden. The woman whose jam making has improved enough that she is selling at the county fair and making $70 a year from something she was throwing away before. The girl who's going to teachers' college next fall partly because you sat at her mother's kitchen table and laid the scholarship information out on the cloth between you. These things happened. They are not in the county report, but they happened. The home demonstration movement in the United States began in earnest in the years after 1914, when the Smith-Lever Act formalized the Cooperative Extension Service and provided federal funding for agricultural education at the county level. The Act specified that extension work should serve both farm men and farm women, and the home demonstration program was the mechanism by which farm women were served. At its height, in the mid-20th century, there were home demonstration agents in nearly every rural county in the country, most of them women, most of them trained at land-grant universities in home economics, all of them driving the county roads with their sample kits and their demonstration booklets and their accumulated knowledge of what the kitchens in their territory actually needed. What they brought was not just technique, they brought connection. The farm woman who saw you once a month had, in you, a link to a larger network of information and resources than her geography would otherwise have made accessible. The university extension system behind you was constantly generating new research on nutrition and food safety and crop variety and soil health, and your job was to translate that research from the university into the farm kitchen, in terms and demonstrations that made it real and applicable and not threatening to people who'd been doing things a certain way for a long time and needed to understand why a change was worth the trouble. There were home demonstration clubs, organised by agents like you in communities across the county, where farm women gathered monthly to learn together, to hear a demonstration, to share a meal, and to talk about their lives in a space where talking about their lives was officially the point of the gathering. These clubs were among the most durable social institutions in rural America in the mid-20th century, outlasting many of the individual agents who organized them, persisting in some communities into the 1980s and beyond. They served a social function that was never officially part of the extension mandate, but was understood by every home demonstration agent who ever organized one, that farm women were often isolated in ways that urban women were not, that the distance between farms meant that community had to be constructed deliberately and maintained with intention, and that a gathering of women once a month to learn something and eat lunch together was not just pleasant, it was necessary. You helped organize 4 such clubs in your county. One of them now has 32 members and has been meeting monthly for 6 years. You did not build it. You started it, and the women inside it built it, which is the correct order of things and the one you intended. That club will meet next Tuesday in the basement of the Methodist Church in the county seat, and the demonstration will be on pie crust, a subject you have personally presented 11 times in various settings, and which remains the single most reliable crowd draw in your demonstration repertoire, because pie crust is the thing everyone wants to make, and the thing everyone is most afraid of failing at, and the fear is specific and almost universal. The crust will shrink, the crust will crack, the crust will be tough, the crust will refuse to transfer from the board to the plate in one piece, and the pie that was supposed to be a triumph will arrive at the table looking like something that happened to it rather than something you made. You can make pie crust with your eyes closed. You have made pie crust on a narrow table in a farmhouse kitchen, with the farm wife standing close, and 2 children watching from the doorway, and the crust came out correctly, and the farm wife made one herself immediately after, and her crust also came out correctly, and she ate a slice of the pie 3 days later and told you it was the best she had made, and you wrote that down in your notes because it was worth writing down. You are in the business of competence, in the literal business of helping people become more competent in their own kitchens, and competence is its own reward in a way that is difficult to explain to people who have not experienced it, who have not known what it is to be unable to do something that everyone around you seems to take for granted, and then to be shown how it works, and to feel it work in your own hands. This is what you're driving home thinking about, at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening in October, after the county office meeting, and after the follow-up call you made from the office phone to the college counsellor about Ruth Pratt's scholarship application, and after the drive back across the county on roads you know by feel in the dark. You're tired in the particular way of a person who has been fully present in multiple places over a long day, who has been paying attention in rooms where paying attention mattered, who has been carrying other people's situations in their head alongside their own. You are not sorry. This is your work. It is good work. It is the kind of work that leaves things better than it finds them, which is a standard not every job can meet. You pull into your own driveway, and your husband has left the porch light on, which he always does when you're coming home after dark, and the kitchen light is on too, and through the window you can see the counter where something has been left on a plate with a dish towel over it, which means he ate and saved yours, which is the thing you asked him to do when the job started and the evening hours became unpredictable, and which he has done without complaint every evening since. You sit in the car for 1 more minute, finishing the habit of transition, then you go in. The 3rd visit of your day is one you have been thinking about since you left the county office on Friday. Not because it is particularly complicated, but because it involves something that requires more care than the usual demonstration. A situation where the cooking knowledge is not the primary need, but is the vehicle through which you can address something that is. The woman's name is Florence, and she lives 10 miles north on a dairy farm with her husband and 3 children under 8, and you have been visiting Florence for 14 months. And in that time you have taught her pressure canning and the new formula for stretching the family's meat budget, and 2 approaches to baking that have improved her bread significantly. And Florence is an attentive student who applies what you show her immediately and correctly, and who has been improving at a pace that would be satisfying in almost any other context. But Florence has also, in the last 3 visits, mentioned her husband's temper in ways that are not casual, in ways that involve her eyes going to the window and her voice dropping in the middle of a sentence, and you have been trained for this, not formally, because formal training for this did not exist in any systematic way in 1953, but informally by the woman who held your job before you and who told you, on one of the 2 occasions you overlapped before she left for the county seat, that sometimes the hardest thing in the kitchen is not the cooking. You arrive at Florence's farm at 2:30. Her children are down for their rest, which she arranged when you called on Thursday to confirm your visit, because she knows that the conversations go better when the children are not present, which tells you that she thinks of what you're doing as conversations rather than demonstrations, which is the right word for what the visits have become. Florence has coffee on and the kitchen smells of the soup she made this morning, a vegetable soup with the last of the garden tomatoes, and the kitchen is clean and organised, and Florence herself looks tired in the particular way that says not just lack of sleep but sustained management of a situation, which is a different kind of tired and one you recognise. You sit down with your coffee and you talk about the soup because starting with the work is how you always start, and today's demonstration is a simple one, a new approach to stretching the ground beef further in the recipes Florence uses it in, adding oats and grated carrot and a little onion into the meatloaf, in proportions that do not change the texture in ways the family will notice, but reduce the amount of meat required by roughly a third, which on a dairy farm in a year when the milk prices have been low is worth knowing. Florence makes notes while you demonstrate, the same notes she always makes, in the small notebook with the red cover that has been on the kitchen table at every visit and is now quite full. After the demonstration you sit for longer than the demonstration requires, and Florence pours more coffee, and eventually you say the thing you have been thinking about how to say since Friday, which is that you have noticed she seems tired lately, and that you wanted to ask if everything's all right. It is not a dramatic question. It is asked quietly, in the same tone as the rest of the conversation, without urgency, in a way that gives Florence as much room as she needs to answer, or not answer as she chooses. She looks at the window, then she looks at her coffee. Then she says a few things that are the beginning of what she's been needing to say for longer than you have known her. You do not have solutions to offer Florence that are adequate to her situation. What you have is a name, the county social worker, a woman you have worked with twice before in your time in this job, who is careful and who keeps confidences, and who understands the particular constraints of rural farm life in ways that allow her to be useful rather than merely official. You write the name and the phone number on a page torn from your own notebook, and you put it on the table between you, and you say that you know of this person because other people you have worked with have found her helpful, which is true, and that you are not saying Florence needs to call her, which is also true, and that you are saying the number is there if she ever wants it, which is all you can say and which is the right thing to say. Florence puts the paper in the pocket of her apron. She may call, she may not. You cannot control what happens after you leave. You can show up, and you can listen, and you can leave the number, and then you have to trust the person in front of you to do what she can with the resources available to her, which is the same thing you ask of yourself every day when you leave a kitchen and drive to the next one. You cannot fix everything. You can do what you actually have the ability to do, and you can do it carefully and with full attention, and you can come back next month, which you will. You leave Florence's farm at 4 o'clock. You sit in the car for slightly longer than usual. Then you start the engine and drive toward the county office and the meeting that will run until 6, and in which nothing you did today will be reported, because what you did today is not the kind of thing that appears in a county report. What appears in county reports is canning numbers and club membership and the survey data on nutritional knowledge in farm households before and after demonstration visits. What does not appear is the piece of paper with the social worker's number on it, or the conversation in the kitchen while the children rested, or the thing Florence said while looking at the window, or the particular quality of the drive home when you've been in a kitchen where the need was bigger than the demonstration, and you did what you could with what you had. You add it to the running account you keep in your head, the account of the days that required more than you were officially asked to give, and in which you gave it anyway, the account that has no page in any official ledger, and no line in any county budget, and which is entirely yours, and which grows longer every year, and which is the real measure of the work you do in those kitchens, alongside the canning numbers and the club memberships, and all the rest of the things that can be counted. There is something worth lingering on before we leave this job and these roads and these kitchen tables, because the home demonstration movement is one of the genuinely underappreciated institutions of mid-20th century American life. One of those things that did an enormous amount of quiet good and has not received anything close to the historical attention it deserves. Consider what it actually was: a federally funded, university-supported network of women employed to go into rural homes and provide practical education, social connection, and access to resources to women who were often otherwise quite isolated. At its peak, this network reached millions of farm women across the country. The cumulative effect of those visits, those demonstrations, those clubs, those conversations at kitchen tables about scholarship applications and canning safety in the school lunch program is incalculable in any strict sense, but it is also undeniable. Children grew up better fed. Women learned skills that improved their households' economic situations. Communities found gathering points that would not otherwise have existed. Girls went to college who would not otherwise have considered it possible. The women doing this work were, for the most part, well educated for their era, trained at land-grant universities in programs that took domestic science as seriously as any other applied discipline, armed with research from institutions that were genuinely trying to understand what rural families needed and how to provide it. They worked long hours, drove difficult roads, managed complex interpersonal dynamics in the kitchens of women who had every right to be suspicious of an official from outside telling them how to do what they had always done. And they navigated those dynamics mostly with the skill and patience and genuine respect that the job required. The home economics tradition that produced these agents has a complicated legacy because it sits at the intersection of genuine progress and genuine limitation. On the progressive side, it took the work of women's domestic lives seriously as a subject worthy of scientific inquiry and professional training. It acknowledged that running a household required real skill and that skill could be taught and improved. It created pathways for educated women into professional employment at a time when professional employment for women was limited. On the limiting side, it also reinforced the assumption that domestic work was primarily women's work, that the sphere of the home was where female intelligence and female training properly belonged, and that the highest expression of a woman's education was an improved kitchen rather than an expanded set of possibilities beyond it. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The home demonstration agent driving the county roads in her 1949 Ford, carrying her sample kit and her scholarship information, and her knowledge of pressure canning and pie crust, and the particular needs of the women on the farm she visited, was doing something genuinely valuable, and doing it within a framework that simultaneously valued and constrained her. That is the complicated position women occupied in the mid-20th century across almost every domain of American life. Essential and undervalued, skilled and underpaid, present everywhere and acknowledged nowhere near enough. The Extension Service still exists. The home demonstration program in its original form does not, having been reorganized and reduced and transformed over the decades since its peak. But the knowledge it transmitted, the skills it taught, the clubs it organized, and the conversations it made possible at kitchen tables across rural America, those things left a mark that outlasted the institution itself, the way any genuine teaching always does, in the people who received it, and the people those people taught, and the people they taught, and the long invisible thread of competence and confidence that runs from a farmhouse kitchen in 1953 to a kitchen today where someone is making pie crust for the first time and is not afraid. And now let us look at the kitchen from the outside, from the advertisements which were everywhere in the post-war years, in the women's magazines and the newspaper supplements and the radio programs and the early television broadcasts, all of them featuring the same kitchen, clean and bright and modern, with its white appliances and its gleaming surfaces and its window above the sink through which the light came in on a world of tidy suburban promise. And at the centre of that kitchen, always, the woman, smiling, rested, wearing something that would not survive actual cooking, holding a casserole dish or a jello mould or a new model vacuum cleaner with the expression of someone for whom domestic life is a continuous source of satisfaction, a woman for whom the kitchen is not a place of labour, but a stage on which she performs her best self every morning, effortlessly. You have spent this evening in that kitchen. You know what the advertisements left out. They left out the 5:45 alarm. They left out the specific fatigue of standing on linoleum for 6 hours. They left out the grocery list that requires systematic inventory and careful planning and the kind of logistical thinking that would be called project management if it happened in an office. They left out the 22 minutes of dishes after dinner and the pots and the stovewipe and the floor and all of it again tomorrow. They left out the way the kitchen is always the last room to be clean and the first room to need cleaning again. They left out the weight of the laundry basket and the smell of the ironing and the specific texture of an afternoon spent on your feet, when your feet have already spent a morning on your feet and the day is not yet finished with them. The post-war American kitchen was presented to the country and to the women inside it as a monument to progress and liberation. The new appliances were framed not as tools that would reduce labour, but as products that would elevate the woman who used them, that would bring her into a modern era of convenience and ease where the drudgery of her grandmother's kitchen was abolished and replaced by something almost effortless. The advertisement for the new Frigidaire refrigerator did not say that it would take you 11 years to understand exactly how to use it most efficiently. It said it would set you free. This was not entirely dishonest. The new refrigerator was genuinely better than the icebox. The electric range was genuinely more controllable than the wood-burning stove. The automatic washing machine represented an enormous reduction in the labour of laundry, which before its arrival had been one of the most physically demanding tasks in a household's weekly routine. The tools were better. The claim that the tools had resolved the problem of domestic labour was something quite different. Because the problem of domestic labour was not primarily technological, it was organisational and social, and it was embedded in a set of assumptions about whose responsibility the household was, and what that responsibility required, and what constituted an acceptable standard of completion. And those assumptions, unlike the appliances, did not update with each new model year. The post-war decade saw a phenomenon that economists would later call the Diderot effect applied to the household. Each new appliance that reduced the labour of one task also raised the standard of performance for that task, so that the time saved by the electric washing machine was consumed by the expectation of cleaner laundry, more frequently washed, and the time saved by the vacuum cleaner was consumed by the expectation of floors vacuumed more often and more thoroughly, and the net change in the total time spent on domestic work was, across the post-war decades, remarkably small. The machines got faster, the standards got higher, the woman inside the kitchen kept pace. This is documented not in the advertisements, but in the time use studies that were conducted during the 1950s and 60s by researchers who wanted to understand what was actually happening inside American households, who actually timed how long domestic tasks took and how often they were performed and by whom. The results, which were not published in the women's magazines, showed that the full-time housewife in the mid-1950s spent an average of more than 50 hours per week on household tasks, a figure that had not decreased significantly from the estimates of her grandmother's generation, despite the new appliances, and which in some categories, particularly cooking and cleaning, had actually increased. 50 hours per week, more than a full-time job, without weekends, without sick days, without any formal mechanism for acknowledging that the work had been done, or measuring how well it had been done, or providing any compensation beyond the ongoing function of the household itself. The 30 unwritten rules of the 1950s kitchen were not arbitrary. They had reasons. The reason you thawed meat in the refrigerator and not on the counter was bacterial safety, and the reason you knew this, even if you did not know the word bacteria, was that someone in your community had learned it the hard way, or you had, or your mother had, and the knowledge passed forward as habit even after the reason behind it faded from memory. The reason you seasoned throughout the cooking process rather than at the end was chemistry. Salt affects texture and moisture, and the way flavours develop, and seasoning at each stage produces a different result than correcting at the end. And knowing this is knowing something real about the physical world, not just following a preference. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. The reason the cast iron skillet mattered, the reason its weight was worth its inconvenience, the reason you would not trade it for the lighter aluminum pan no matter what the catalogue said, was the way heat moved through it, and the way that heat movement produced results that the aluminum pan, however modern, could not quite replicate. The rules were knowledge, accumulated, tested, refined, passed forward, and the women who held that knowledge were, in the most precise sense of the word, experts. They had expertise in a domain that was not called expertise because it was domestic, because it was feminine, because it happened inside a house rather than inside a company or a laboratory, or any of the other places where expertise is acknowledged as such. But the expertise was real, and its absence would have been immediately and catastrophically apparent to anyone who experienced it. What the 1950s kitchen required which the advertisements did not show and the etiquette manuals did not articulate, and the women's magazines did not quite name, was a form of management that combined logistical planning, physical execution, technical knowledge, interpersonal attunement and aesthetic judgment, all deployed simultaneously, continuously, across a 12 to 14-hour day within a budget that required constant calibration to a standard that was essentially invisible when met and immediately apparent when not. This is not a job description. It is the actual content of the work that the woman at the centre of every post-war advertisement was doing, behind the smile and the casserole dish and the gleaming surfaces. The magazines understood some of this. The best of the women's magazines of the post-war period, Good Housekeeping, McCall's, Ladies' Home Journal, occasionally ran articles that acknowledged the real demands of domestic life in ways that were honest and occasionally even radical, that pushed back against the expectation of effortless performance and named the exhaustion directly. But these articles ran alongside the advertisements, and the advertisements were where the money was, and the money required the image of the smiling woman with the frigid air. And so the articles said one thing and the context around them said another, and the women reading them navigated that contradiction the way they navigated most contradictions, quietly, privately, with the practical intelligence of people who understand that the gap between the official image and the lived reality is real, but also navigable, and that naming it too loudly is its own kind of risk. The standard of cleanliness that prevailed in American kitchens and homes in the 1950s was not a natural standard. It was constructed, carefully and deliberately, by the manufacturers of cleaning products who had every financial reason to raise the bar and no reason to lower it. The Procter & Gamble advertisement that said a kitchen should sparkle was not a description of a pre-existing standard. It was the creation of one, and the creation of it served Procter & Gamble because a woman who believed her kitchen should sparkle would buy more of the products that helped it sparkle than a woman who believed her kitchen should merely be clean. This process, which historians of advertising call aspirational messaging, and which women living inside it experienced as the persistent sense that they were not quite meeting expectations they could not entirely see, shaped domestic life in the post-war decades in ways that were real and material and rarely spoken aloud. The floors were waxed because the floors were supposed to be waxed. The floors were supposed to be waxed because the manufacturer of floor wax said so, in terms warm and reassuring enough that the woman who did the waxing understood it as her own preference. Whether it was her preference, or whether it was a preference installed in her by 40 years of advertising, is a question that gets philosophically complicated very quickly, and the women inside those kitchens did not, mostly, have the vocabulary or the framework to ask it directly. They waxed the floors. The floors were beautiful. The beauty was real, even if the necessity of it was invented. There were women who resisted. There have always been women who resisted. Not dramatically, not visibly, not in ways that made it into the magazines of the time, but in the accumulated small decisions of actual domestic life. The woman who decided the floor wax was excessive and did not use it. The woman who served the same dinner twice in 1 week because it was good and she was tired and see above. The woman who asked her husband to do the dishes one night and established a precedent that held. The woman who read Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique when it was published in 1963 and recognized in it the name of the thing she'd been feeling for years without quite being able to articulate, and who did not know whether to feel validated or angry or something more complicated than either of those, and who probably felt all three. The Feminine Mystique named something. It named the particular malaise of educated women confined to domestic roles they had not entirely chosen and could not entirely leave. The dissatisfaction that had no official name and for which the available remedies were offered by the same consumer culture that had produced the dissatisfaction. A better appliance, a more stimulating recipe, a more organised household. Friedan called it the problem that has no name, and the accuracy of that phrase, its resonance with women who'd been living with the problem while lacking the language for it, is why the book landed the way it did. The 1950s kitchen was not a trap, that is important to say. For many women, it was a genuine domain, a space of real skill and real satisfaction, and real community, a place where their intelligence found expression and their labour produced results that mattered to the people they loved. The woman at the stove at 5:45 was not a victim. She was a person doing difficult work inside a system that did not fully acknowledge the difficulty, which is a situation considerably different from victimhood and requiring a considerably more nuanced response. What was unjust was not the kitchen. What was unjust was the invisibility of the expertise, the invisibility of the labour, the invisibility of the planning and the skill and the daily sustained effort that made the kitchen run. The invisibility was built into the image. The gleaming surface, the effortless smile, the casserole appearing from the oven without apparent effort, all of it designed to present the kitchen as a place where competence was instantaneous and innate rather than acquired and maintained through years of practice. And that image, however beautiful, however appealing, however much it reflected genuine aspirations rather than cynical deception, served the purpose of making the work invisible and making the workers inside it feel that they were doing something simple, when what they were doing was something genuinely hard. The hidden rules of the 1950s kitchen were not only about technique and food safety, and the efficient management of time and resources. Some of them were social rules, rules about what the kitchen signified and who could see it in what condition, and what that condition said about the woman responsible for it. These rules were as precise and as binding as any recipe, and they were transmitted with the same combination of explicit instruction and unspoken assumption that governed everything else in the domestic culture of the era. The rule that the kitchen must be clean before company came was not primarily a hygiene rule, though hygiene was part of it. It was a social rule, a rule about presentation and judgment, and the particular way a kitchen's condition reflected on the woman who kept it. Neighbourhood women dropped by one another's homes in the 1950s with a frequency and a casualness that would seem remarkable today, and the kitchen they encountered when they came in through the back door, as neighbours did in many communities, was subject to evaluation in a way that was rarely explicit but was entirely real. A kitchen that was clean said something. A kitchen that was not clean said something else. The woman who kept a clean kitchen was organised, capable, in control. The woman whose kitchen was less than perfectly ordered was subject to a judgment that extended far beyond her kitchen surfaces. The rule about the dish towel was a social rule. The dish towel should be clean and should be hanging straight, and a dish towel that was wadded or stained or casually draped over the faucet handle said something about the kitchen, and by extension about the woman, and that something was negative in a way that was disproportionate to the actual importance of where a dish towel was hanging. But disproportionate was not the same as unreal, and the women who understood this rule understood it because they had experienced the alternative, had felt the slight cooling of a neighbour's tone at the sight of a disordered kitchen, had absorbed the message that their domestic performance was always subject to evaluation, and had adjusted accordingly. The rule about the coffee being ready was a hospitality rule that was also a social rule. A woman whose coffee was ready when company came was a woman who was in control of her household. A woman who had to make coffee when company arrived was a woman who had been caught unprepared, which was a lesser version of the same judgment, but a judgment nonetheless. The social world of the 1950s suburban neighbourhood ran on this kind of quiet evaluation, on the constant low-level assessment of each other's domestic performance, and the women inside it were both the evaluators and the evaluated, which is one of the more precise forms of self-regulation that any social system produces. The rule about the refrigerator was not spoken of at all, which made it in some ways the most binding of all. Your refrigerator was a private space, but not so private that a neighbour who came to borrow something would not sometimes see inside it, and what was inside it was subject to the same evaluation as the rest of the kitchen. A refrigerator that was organised and not overcrowded and did not smell of anything unusual was a refrigerator that spoke well of its keeper. A refrigerator that was chaotic or contained leftovers in unidentifiable states of age was a refrigerator that said something the keeper would not have chosen to say. So the refrigerator was organised. The oldest leftovers went to the front. Nothing was allowed to become unidentifiable. This was not paranoia. It was accurate social intelligence operating at the level of the everyday. The rule about the grocery budget was never spoken in mixed company, by which is meant in the presence of husbands, which in the post-war suburban middle class was nearly always the company that defined mixed. The grocery budget was a domestic matter, and domestic matters were managed by women, and the management of them was therefore both entirely the woman's responsibility and entirely invisible to the person whose income made the budget possible. The woman who could feed 4 people on $40 a week and do it without anyone at the table noticing the arithmetic behind the menu was performing a genuine feat of resource management that had no official name and no official recognition and that she was expected to perform without comment or credit, because commenting on it would have been itself a kind of violation, a drawing of attention to the mechanism behind the magic, and the magic was supposed to look like it cost nothing. The rule about fatigue was the most invisible rule of all. You did not admit to fatigue. You did not let fatigue show in the quality of what you produced. The dinner at 6 was as good as the dinner at 6 last Thursday, even if you slept badly, and the children had been difficult, and the washing machine had required 2 hours of your morning, and you had been on your feet since 5:45 without a real break. Fatigue was your problem, and you managed it internally, with your second cup of coffee at 10:30, and the brief moment in the quiet kitchen before the children came home, and the knowledge that Thursday was always harder than Tuesday, but that Thursday always ended, and then came Friday, and on Friday sometimes you baked bread. The bread baking was not in the budget analysis. The bread baking was not in the time you studies, not quite, not the way you experienced it, because the bread baking was the one thing in the kitchen that returned something you had not programmed into it, that arrived with a warmth and a smell and a particular quality of physical engagement that was different from the other tasks, that asked something of your hands and gave something back in return, that produced at the end a loaf that had not existed before you made it, and that was unambiguously good, and that in the eating of it communicated something about the household that no store-bought loaf could replicate, something about care and time and the specific love that is expressed in the act of making rather than purchasing. This too was a rule, not a rule anyone enforced, a rule you made yourself, somewhere in the middle years of running this kitchen, when you discovered that the work went better when some of it was chosen rather than required, when at least one task in the weekly rotation was something you would have done regardless of whether the household needed it. The bread was chosen, the bread was yours. The bread was the place in the kitchen where the rule was your own rule, and following it made the other rules easier to live with. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the women inside these kitchens, the thing the advertisements entirely missed, that they were not passive within the system. They were negotiating with it constantly, finding the places where their own preferences could find expression inside the framework of what was required, making room for pleasure inside the structure of obligation, and doing it quietly and without expectation of recognition, because recognition was not on offer, and they had long since made peace with that, and found what they needed in the kitchen itself, in the clean counter and the warm stove and the bread that was rising in the bowl and smelling exactly the way they wanted it to smell. The rules about the children in the kitchen deserve their own attention, because the kitchen was not only a production space in the 1950s household, it was also a transmission space, the place where knowledge moved from one generation to the next in the oldest possible way, through proximity and observation, and the gradual assumption of small tasks that grew larger as the child grew more capable. The rule about children in the kitchen was that they were present from an early age and that their presence was managed rather than prevented, because the alternative to teaching a child in the kitchen was a child who did not know how to manage a kitchen, and that alternative had costs that the woman at the stove could see clearly even when no one else articulated them. Your daughter stands at the counter beside you and stirs. She has been stirring things since she was 3 years old, standing on her stool with the dish towel tucked into her collar because aprons in her size were not easily found, and stirring with the concentration of someone performing surgery. She stirs the pancake batter on Sunday mornings, and the cookie dough when you bake, and the pudding that requires constant attention on the stove, which you taught her requires constant attention by standing beside her the first 6 times until she could feel in her own stirring arm the way the pudding changes texture as it thickens. That slight increase in resistance that means it is almost ready, and that you can recognize through a wooden spoon if you have paid enough attention. She can recognize it now. She is 9 years old, and she can feel when pudding is almost ready, which is a form of knowledge she'll have for the rest of her life, and which you have given her, not by explaining it, but by standing next to her while she learned it through her own hands. The rule about teaching in the kitchen was that you taught alongside rather than in front of, that the best instruction happened when the child was doing the thing rather than watching you do it, that the goal was always for them to arrive at the place where their hands knew what your hands knew, not to demonstrate your own competence. This is a teaching philosophy you arrived at through experience rather than theory, through the memory of your own mother teaching you to roll pastry crust, not by rolling it in front of you and handing you the finished product to see, but by standing behind you with her hands over yours and guiding the pressure and the direction, until you felt it yourself, the way the dough responds to the rolling pin, the places where it wants to stick and the places where it slides freely, and then she stepped back and you did it alone and it was right. The pastry lesson took 3 Saturday mornings to complete to your mother's satisfaction. You did not find this discouraging. You found it interesting, because the gap between the first attempt and the third attempt was visible and specific. You could point to exactly what had improved. The thickness was more even. The crust did not tear at the edge. The transfer from the board to the plate happened cleanly. The improvement was concrete and measurable, and entirely the product of what you had learned through repetition and attention. And knowing that the improvement came from you, and from what you had done rather than from anything external, was a satisfaction of a particular order that your mother seemed to understand you would need to feel in order to want to do it again. You have tried to teach your daughter in the same way. You do not always succeed. You're sometimes in a hurry, and it is easier to do the thing yourself than to stand beside her and watch her do it more slowly. And when this happens, you know you have missed an opportunity, and sometimes you circle back to it and sometimes you do not. But the principle is there, and the principle is right. Knowledge that passes through the hands is knowledge that stays. Knowledge explained from a distance, knowledge transferred by description rather than by doing, is harder to hold and easier to lose. The kitchen as transmission space produced in the mid-20th century a generation of women who knew how to cook because they had cooked, beginning young and in the presence of someone who knew what they were doing and expected them to learn. The cooking knowledge of that generation was deep and practical and largely intuitive in operation, held in the body as much as in the mind, accessible without consulting a book because it had been consolidated through enough repetition that the book was redundant. This is the knowledge that the joy of cooking was available to supplement but not to replace, that no cookbook, however good, could transmit in the way that a kitchen shared over years with a mother or a grandmother could transmit it. What changed as the mid-century moved toward its later decades was the transmission itself. The working women who entered the workforce in increasing numbers from the 1960s onward were less available to stand in kitchens with their daughters on Saturday mornings, not because they valued the transmission less, but because their time was more constrained, and the cooking itself was being reorganized by convenience foods and changing expectations in ways that made some of what they might have transmitted seem less urgent. The cooking knowledge that passed through the hands in those mid-century kitchens was not lost exactly, but it was disrupted, and the disruption showed up in the generation that followed, which was less certain in the kitchen, less intuitive, more reliant on recipes and measurement, precisely because less had been consolidated through repetition into body knowledge. This is not a complaint about the women who went to work who were doing what they needed to do and what they wanted to do, and what the world was finally beginning to make room for them to do. It is an observation about what transmission requires, which is time and proximity, and the willingness to stand next to someone while they do the things slowly and incorrectly at first, and then correctly and eventually without thinking about it. All of those conditions were harder to maintain as life reorganized itself around different priorities, and some of what had passed from kitchen to kitchen across generations became harder to pass, became the kind of thing you had to seek out deliberately, rather than absorb through the ordinary course of living in a household that cooked. The women who are rediscovering sourdough bread and pressure canning and scratch cooking in the 21st century are engaged in a recovery project, whether or not they think of it in those terms. They are retrieving knowledge that was always valuable but that became less automatically available, assembling from books and videos and classes and the occasional grandmother, the kind of understanding that once arrived through years of Saturday mornings in a kitchen. The knowledge is retrievable. The hands can still learn it. The difference is that now it requires intention rather than mere proximity, which is a shift significant enough to notice, and too common to be worth mourning, because the knowledge is still there and people still want it, and the kitchens still exist. The cast iron skillet is still the right tool for the job. The bread still needs 2 rises. The butter still needs to be soft. The percolator still needs the right ratio of water to grounds, and the right flame and the particular attention of someone who has learned its particular personality. These things are true whether or not anyone has stood in a kitchen long enough to feel them in their hands, and they will remain true. They are the physics and the chemistry and the practical reality of the work, and they do not change with the era. What changes is how they are transmitted, and by whom, and over how many Saturday mornings, and with what degree of intention and patience, and the particular love that is expressed in the act of teaching someone to do something well. The question of what changed and what did not in the kitchens of the decades that followed the 1950s is one that does not resolve as cleanly as the histories sometimes suggest. The official story is one of liberation. The women's movement of the 1960s and 70s named the problem and challenged the expectations and opened doors that had been closed, and by the 1980s the American kitchen was no longer a place where a woman's value was primarily measured or her days primarily spent. This is largely true. It is also incomplete. What changed was the cultural permission to acknowledge the labour. What changed was the availability of alternatives, careers, ambitions, arrangements of domestic life that did not require one person to carry the entire weight of it invisibly. What changed was the vocabulary, the ability to name the problem that had no name and to speak it in public and to have others recognise it. What changed less dramatically was the distribution of the labour itself. Study after study conducted from the 1970s through the present day has shown that domestic work, including cooking and cleaning, and the management of the household, continues to fall disproportionately on women, even in households where both partners work full-time. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. Even in households where both partners have explicitly committed to an equal division, even in households that believe themselves to have resolved this question, the gap has narrowed, the gap has not closed, and the mental labour of the household, the planning, the inventory, the anticipation of what is needed and when, the management of the calendar and the social obligations and the health appointments and the school requirements, remains largely invisible in the same way it was invisible in 1953, carried in the heads of the people doing it and unacknowledged by the people who benefit from it. This is not a complaint on behalf of 1950s housewives. It is an observation about the persistence of a pattern, about the way that cultural change at the level of image and expectation does not always or immediately produce corresponding change at the level of daily life. The woman who woke at 5:45 in the cold bedroom and went to the kitchen to start the coffee was doing something that her granddaughter, who also sometimes wakes early, to make sure the household is ready for the day, might recognise more readily than either of them would entirely like. There is something that does not change, which is the satisfaction of a kitchen that works, of a household that runs, of a meal at 6 that 4 people eat together, and that is good. The tools are different now, and the social arrangements are different, and the expectations are different in ways both real and incomplete. But the satisfaction of a morning that comes together correctly, of bread that is timed right, and coffee that is ready, and the quiet moment in the kitchen before the day fully begins, that is a continuous human thing, older than the 1950s, older than the advertisements, older than the etiquette manuals and the home demonstration agents and the red-covered cookbooks, as old as the act of making a meal for the people you love and having it be good. The 30 hidden rules of the 1950s kitchen were knowledge disguised as habit, expertise disguised as nature, and labour disguised as love. They were real, all 3. The knowledge was hard-won and worth knowing. The expertise was genuine and deserved acknowledgement. The love was real and not diminished by the fact that it operated inside a system that did not fully acknowledge what it cost. Women in kitchens made things work under conditions that were often unreasonable. They did it with intelligence and resourcefulness and a practical creativity that left very little evidence, because it left no waste, no surplus, nothing beyond the smoothly functioning day. The evidence was the running household. The running household was the evidence. It is the least dramatic kind of achievement and the most persistent, and it is worth noticing tonight before sleep, in the specific way that things that have been overlooked for a long time deserve to be noticed. We have spent this evening in a particular American kitchen, the one with the yellow walls and the cast-iron skillet and the grocery list in the notepad drawer, and we have travelled out from it through the stories that surround it. The woman who wrote a cookbook out of grief and gave her readers permission to trust themselves, the agent who drove the county roads with her sample kit, and her scholarship information, and her genuine belief that the work she was doing was improving the lives of the women she visited, and the invisible system underneath all of it, the 50 hours a week of planning and executing and maintaining that produced the effortless surface the advertisements displayed. What connects these stories is something simpler than any of the systems inside them. Something that runs beneath the household budgets and the canning demonstrations and the time use studies and the advertisements. Something that shows up in Irma Rombauer writing her cookbook at 52 in the aftermath of loss, and in Edna Pratt letting a stranger in through the kitchen door and then trusting her enough, eventually, to talk about her daughter, and in the woman at the stove at 5:45 who knows the kitchen so well that the knowledge has moved out of her mind and into her hands. What connects them is the practice of caring for what is in front of you with full attention and genuine skill, day after day, in conditions that are not ideal and without the acknowledgement the work deserves, because the work matters regardless of whether it is acknowledged, because the family at the 6 o'clock dinner table is real, and the meal is real, and the warmth of the kitchen in October is real, and these things are worth making well even when no one is watching. The rules that no cookbook wrote down were not arbitrary. They were the accumulated intelligence of women who took their work seriously, and who passed what they learned to each other across fences and kitchen tables, and church basements and county extension meetings, in a transmission of practical knowledge so continuous and so unglamorous that it barely registered as a thing that was happening. But it was happening. It is one of the most sustained examples of collective knowledge building in American history, and it happened primarily in kitchens, and it was done primarily by women, and it is why the kitchens worked. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the kitchen settle around you in imagination. The yellow walls, the percolator on the back burner, the cast iron skillet cooling on the stove. The grocery list is done, the laundry is folded, the table is set for tomorrow. Outside the window, the October maple is losing its leaves in the dark. Somewhere in the neighbourhood, another kitchen light is still on, another woman finishing the evening's last tasks, wiping down the counter one more time with the particular efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times, and who knows it will need doing again tomorrow, and who does it anyway. And well, because that is what the work requires, and the work is hers. The percolator is cold by now. The house is quiet. Everyone else has gone to bed. She stands in the kitchen for one more moment, in the finished day, in the clean room that was not clean when she woke, and is clean now because of what she did between waking and this moment. She turns off the light. Tomorrow begins at 5:45, but that is tomorrow, and tonight the kitchen is clean, and the bread is rising in the bowl, and the house smells like the particular October warmth of a household that is held together and running and good. Sleep well. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.